Pastor Jeff said we're starting a new series today called Tell Me a Story. It's been said that one of the defining characteristics of being human is that we love to tell stories, and the stories that we listen to and tell, and maybe most importantly, the stories that we tell ourselves have this powerful way to shape us and orient us to the world and to who we are. And so they tell us something about what's going on. They let us know, is the world a fair and a just place? Or is it unpredictable, unfair, unsafe? Are things generally getting better? Or are things generally getting worse, descending into chaos? It tells us a little bit about who we are. Are we the center, the main character in the story? Does everything revolve around us? Or are we maybe an extra, a bit actor, someone back in the chorus? Are we the hero? Are we the villain? Or maybe we're the victim. You see, the stories we tell work on us and shape us, and not primarily just by giving us information that we process with our heads, but they work on our hearts and our souls. They draw us into the story and invite us to see our lives through those lenses. And so I don't think it's a mistake that by far the most common type of literature in the entire Bible is story. It's narrative and parable. You probably already know this, but the Bible isn't just one book. It's not just one type of literature, but there's lots of different types of literature in it. There's poetry and songs and census records and land grants and prophecy and letters, all different types of literature, but by far, the most common one is story. And it's through these hundreds and hundreds of smaller stories that you and I are invited into the story, really the only story that's true, the story of a loving God and a fallen creation, and a divine rescue plan centered on the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so throughout this series, throughout this summer, we're going to listen closely to a handful of these stories, and we're going to ask the Holy Spirit to orient us once again, to turn us back, to teach us who is God, what is He doing, who are we, what's our role in the story. And today we begin with maybe one of the most famous stories in all of the Bible, David and Goliath. Now, this isn't backed up by any real research, but my hunch is that if you were to go downtown later today or this week and you're just going to start asking random people, tell me a Bible story or two, can you name one? David and Goliath would be pretty high on the list. And maybe even they could give you a few details of what happened, what we just heard from 1 Samuel 17, because in many ways, this story of David and Goliath has taken on a bigger meaning for our culture than simply what we heard. It's grown beyond the pages of 1 Samuel 17, and now it includes all sorts of underdog stories. And as Americans, we love a good underdog story. It's in our sports. Part of the allure of sports is that on any given day, the smaller, weaker team could rise up, could slay the giant, and walk off the field victorious. It's in our national history. Think about George Washington, the Continental Army, crossing the Delaware overnight to fight and defeat the British Empire. It's in our movies. Star Wars, that ragtag rebellion, fighting it with nothing but hope sometimes against the evil galactic empire. We love underdog stories, stories of perseverance, of standing up to your giants, of continuing to fight when everything seems lost. It's in business and politics and everywhere else where the little guy takes on and beats a stronger, better, more well-equipped opponent. And yet there's a risk for us here. This familiarity with the story of David and Goliath is part of the challenge for us this morning as followers of Jesus. Because it'd be easy for us to take all of those lessons that the culture has taught us about being an underdog, about perseverance, about being courageous in the face of giants, to take all of those lessons and lay them back on top of the biblical account and say, I know this one already. I've heard it 1,000 times. I've already learned everything that this story has to teach me. And we might miss or just skim over what God has to say to us today. So my invitation is resist that urge. Don't tune out. Don't take a nap. But focus in, lock in as we hear again this familiar story, but perhaps with fresh ears, the story of David and Goliath. It begins like all good stories do by setting the scene for us. 1 Samuel 17 tells us that the Philistines have once again invaded Judah, that they've set up camp about 15 miles west of Bethlehem on one side of the valley of Elah, and that Saul and his army, the Israelite army, has gone out to meet this challenge, and they've set up camp on the other side of the valley. Both sides dig in, they prepare for battle, and then nothing happens. This is a picture of the Valley of Elah. It gives you a little bit of an idea of what the landscape was around there. And from looking at this, you can kind of see why nothing happened at first. Neither side was all that eager to leave their protected position in the high ground to go down into the valley and then have to fight uphill against an entrenched and determined opponent. And the way the hills and the mountains come together in this place, there was really no way to try to go around and flank the enemy. And so it looked like it was going to be a stalemate. But the Philistines had an ace up their sleeve, a champion by the name of Goliath, whose name has now become synonymous with all things gigantic and huge. 1 Samuel 17 tells us that Goliath was 6 cubits in a span, and I don't know what that converts to. Anybody? No, I don't know what that converts to. Scholars tell us it's anywhere between 9 and 11 feet tall, 6 cubits in a span. It goes into detail as to all of his armor and the weapons and the weight of everything he was carrying. And if you add it all up, it was somewhere north of 200 pounds of gear that he had with him. This was absolutely an enormous man. If we were to put him into pop culture terms, he would be the Thanos of the ancient world, an unstoppable, unbeatable, inevitable killing machine. And so it's easy to see why Goliath was chosen to be the Philistine champion, why he was the one to win the war with one stroke of his sword. Single combat was a common way wars were decided in the ancient world, where 2 champions would fight to the death to decide who would win the entire battle. It avoided unnecessary bloodshed. But it was more than just that. It wasn't just a contest between men or champions. It was a way to test the will of the gods, to see whose God was stronger, was better, who the gods wanted to win. And so when Goliath stepped out from the Philistine battle lines and went down into the valley and issued his challenge to Israel, it wasn't just a challenge to the nation or to a man or to King Saul. It was a challenge to God. Now, even before David steps onto the scene, the Israelites should have had an answer, a response to Goliath. In fact, he was sitting right there in their camp. Their king, Saul, should have been their champion. We read in earlier chapters how Saul was a head taller than anyone else in Israel, how Saul had already fought and won battles, including against this same Philistine army on at least one occasion. And the whole job description of being a king, the whole reason Israel asked for a king, was to have someone to lead them, to go out and fight their battles on their behalf. And so when Goliath issues his challenge, should have been Saul's moment. Saul should have been the one to kill Goliath in the name of the Lord. Saul should have been the one about whom the people sang praises after a great victory. But by this time, Saul has demonstrated that he's a disobedient king, that he doesn't trust in the promises of God. And so God has rejected Saul as king. He's a lame duck. God's Spirit has been taken away from Saul. And so when he hears Goliath, his challenge, and when he sees him with his eyes, all he can see is despair and defeat and death. And this spiritual sickness that's infected Saul, a lack of trust in God's promises, it's now spreading to the rest of the Israelite army. For 40 days, the army marches out, takes up their battle positions. And for 40 days, the entire army is turned back in fear by the arrogant, blasphemous boasting of this one man. For 40 days, Goliath stands in the valley, shouting his challenges, jeering, taunting, cursing, and mocking Israel and Israel's God. And it takes a shepherd boy on an errand to his brothers to see things for what they really are. To see that this is not simply a challenge, a contest between men and nations, but that this is a challenge and a contest for God. It takes David, the one who's now been anointed by God, the one on whom God's Spirit now rests, to see Goliath for who he really is. A stain on the honor of Israel and Israel's God that should have been blotted out the moment he opened his mouth. And you heard what happens next. David's confidence earns him an audience with the king. And in front of Saul, David talks about all of the times God has already delivered him from lions and from bears. And he looks at that history as proof that God will deliver him again. And so with no armor, with none of the traditional weapons, with just a staff and a sling and 5 smooth stones, David takes on and takes out Goliath. And we get the scene as both men kind of leave their battle lines and come to the center of the valley, almost like a couple of boxers squaring off before a match with all of the usual taunts and jeers that come before that. And Goliath gives his taunts and curses David in the name of his gods. But David says this. He says, "You come against me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you dead and cut off your head, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by the sword or the spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Notice how many times David invokes the name of the Lord. His trust, his confidence, and his faith are not in himself. They're not in his weapons and his own strength. Human strength and ability has reached its limit. David's trust is in the Lord. The Lord is David's battle cry. The Lord is David's refrain. It's the name of the Lord that David pits against Goliath's sword and spear and javelin. And it is the Lord who will hand Goliath and the entire Philistine army over. Also that the Lord might be glorified. That everyone there and anywhere else would know that the battle is the Lord's. And that the Lord is the only one who can save. And so with one shot of his sling, David crushes the Philistine's forehead. And then just like he said he would, David takes Goliath's own sword, the same sword that Goliath used to terrify God's people, and he cuts off the giant's head. And now it's the Philistines who turn and run. And now it's God's people who come out from their hiding places and surge across the field to claim the victory that God has won for them through his chosen man, David. Because the battle is the Lord's. The Lord is the champion of this fight. The Lord is the one who saves. There are all sorts of lessons that we could draw out of this story, ways that we could understand our lives through this lens. One of the ways that we understand stories is by stepping into the shoes of the characters and applying them to our lives, living through them. And so it would be easy here this morning for us to decide that we're David, that we all face giants of one kind or another, enemies that seek to enslave and kill us and make us despair that God's promises will never come true. Mental health challenge or terminal illness for which there are no good treatment options. A change in your family, job loss, new city, new school, a break that brings with it an uncertain and a frightening future. An economic and a political landscape where you look out and you don't know where you fit anymore. And you have no idea how it's all going to work out this time. An addiction to a substance, to a behavior, to a website, that no matter how many times you say no, it comes back, jeering and taunting your feeble efforts to resist. Maybe especially today, the loss of a loved one, sudden and unexpected, when we had hoped and prayed for something different. The giants that we face are real and personal. They're unique to every one of us. And yet they all have at least this one thing in common. They are masks for our ancient enemies of sin and death and the devil. Every one of them seeks to steal and kill and destroy, to separate you from your God, from your champion. And all we can see with our eyes is that we don't have a chance. That our human strength, our human ability has reached a limit, and that we're like a boy fighting a giant. And so it would be easy to conclude that the lesson of this story is that you and I are David, facing off against these colossal giants in our lives, and that all we got to do is have faith, to persevere, to stand up to them, to have courage, because God favors the underdog. And with God on your side, with a little help from God, you can win. You can slay the giant. Don't be like Saul, cowering in the background. Be like David. Be bold. Be courageous. And you will win the victory. Of course, there's some truth to that, right? If we're to look for ourselves in this story, we don't look at David. Because the truth is, I'm not David. And neither are you. If we're going to find ourselves in this story, the place to look is to the people of God, the Israelite army, cowering in fear in the back in the face of a giant bigger and stronger and more terrible than any of us can face on our own. You and I aren't the champion. We're the ones in need of a champion, and someone to step forward, to step into the gap on our behalf, to fight for us. You and I aren't the savior. We're not the hero. We're the ones in need of saving. As Christians, one of the ways that we read the Bible is Christocentrically, which is a big word for saying the whole thing is about Jesus, from beginning to end. That all of it points us to Jesus and the salvation that God is giving us through him. And so as we listen to, as we read these stories, we look for ways that the story points us to Jesus. And in this story, we get all sorts of points of comparison. It's for good reason that one of the Gospel's favorite titles for Jesus is Son of David. Like David, Jesus came from relative obscurity in Bethlehem. Like David, Jesus was anointed by God, given the Spirit to save God's people. Like David, Jesus was mocked and doubted by his family and by those in authority. And we could probably do a whole study on points of comparison between Jesus and David, but also contrasting the two. Because if you would read through 1 Samuel 7 or 1 and 2 Samuel, you'd see that David wasn't perfect. Far from it. That David, as good as he was only a king of Israel. He wasn't the king. He was only a champion of God's people. He wasn't the champion. No, that title of king and champion of the people of God belongs only to Jesus. Because only Jesus trusted in God to save him when everything was lost. When all the world could see was despair and defeat and death, Jesus trusted in the promise of his Father that not even death would defeat him, that no one takes Jesus' life from him, but he lays it down and he picks it back up again. Because like David, slaying the giant with his own sword, it is by death, by sin's greatest and most terrifying weapon against us, it is by death that Jesus destroys death. It is by death that Jesus has slayed the giant. It is by his death and his resurrection that Jesus now stands alive and victorious. And his victory is now your victory. Back in 2018, a woman by the name of Carol Cullen received an email. She was working as in a financial management firm in the Philadelphia area. She received an email from the hometown team, Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles had won the Super Bowl 5 months before, and they were emailing Carol to tell her that they were going to give her a Super Bowl ring. Now, Carol had worked for the Eagles for decades. She'd been fired by a previous coach a couple years before the great victory. And so when it came to the Super Bowl, she really had nothing to do with it. She wasn't part of the team. She wasn't even part of the organization. She certainly never called a play. And yet when her Eagles won, she shared in the spoils of victory, and they sent her this ring, a gold ring with 219 diamonds and 17 green sapphires. Their victory became her victory. Brothers and sisters, you have a champion. You are not called upon to face the giants in your own strength, but you have a champion, someone to step out and fight on your behalf. And your champion is alive and well. In the words of Martin Luther, he holds the field victorious. And it is through Jesus Christ, his victory over sin, over death, over the devil, over every single giant you face. It is through Jesus Christ and his victory that you can stand as well, to look through the eyes of faith, to see things for what they really are, to see the cross and the empty tomb, and to know that your Lord has won for you. To Jesus Christ be all power and glory and dominion now and forever. Amen.